introduction. So welcome to everyone. Bo, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself and your colleagues, and thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Bo Woods. I'm here representing an organization called I Am the Cavalry. We're about a 6-year-old group of security researchers who have just observed that our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it in areas impacting human life and public safety, and wanted to be a part of the solution. So I can talk a little bit more about the organization in a second, but also wanted to make sure that I introduce Dr. Suzanne Schwartz of the FDA and Hannes Molson with Draeger. And Suzanne and Hannes, if you want to just briefly introduce yourselves, that would be great. Suzanne, to you first.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bo. It's a really delight for me to participate in this discussion. And as Jen mentioned as well, we really want to keep this very informal. And I have been at the FDA for 9 years. I'm at the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. I'm currently the acting director of a new office there, the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation. Within the portfolio of the programs that I oversee, medical device cybersecurity takes on a very critical and a very significant aspect of that programmatic space. Been involved in this now for, a bunch of years, really, I guess, since 2013, when FDA really began to dig in deep into this area. And I want to state up front that I credit much of the progress that FDA has made in the medical device cybersecurity space to the relationship that has been built through I Am the Cavalry, through Bo Woods, Josh Corman, and others, and that engagement which has been so absolutely necessary in getting us to where we are today.
Great. Hannes? Well, do we still have Hans, or did he drop off?
I did not drop off. There I am.
There you are.
Perfect. I'm Hannes Molson. Hello. I'm with Draeger, a nearly 130-year-old medical device manufacturer from Germany. And I'm the product security manager for now almost 6 years. And as a product security manager, it's my responsibility in the company to create a secure development lifecycle for the products, which starts with like developer trainings and ends with the incident response and everything in between secure architectures. I'm mainly responsible for anesthesia devices, ventilators, and thermoregulators, but we also have a monitoring portfolio and others. And I got into contact with I'm the Cavalry on security conferences very early. So I met people like Bo Woods and Josh Corman, and from basically the get-go, I myself and also the company of Draeger was collaborating with security researchers to use the community. And this is why we also participated into the translation, for example, of the Hippocratic Oath into German, so that more other medical device manufacturers with more German-speaking developers are able to participate in this. Thanks.
Cool, thanks. So I wanted to just speak a little bit more about I Am the Cavalry, so everybody knows kind of who we are, in case you haven't heard of us before. But as I mentioned, the Cavalry is a group of, started out as just a handful of folks from the security research community, the white hat hacker community. And over time, we've built many, many more colleagues, such as Hannes, such as Suzanne, people from the healthcare community, automotive community, aviation community, and others. And essentially we said our society is adopting connected technology faster than we're able to secure it in areas impacting human life and public safety. Therefore, we need to make sure that those devices and those systems are worthy of the trust we already place in them. Essentially we act as a helpful hand rather than a pointing finger to get industry into a better place, to work with government, to bring in civil society, nonprofits, to reach out to individuals. In our case, a lot of the security researchers who identify as I am the Cavalry are also patients, whether they're infusion insulin pump patients or pacemaker patients. We have a lot of folks who see both sides. And so this gives us a very interesting perspective when it comes to talking, in a high trust, high collaboration engagement with any of the other stakeholders in this ecosystem. As the prior slide alluded to, we published, myself as well as Andy Caravos, who's part of the DiMe Society, and others, published a Journal of Medical Informatics Research, or Journal of Medical Internet Research article on a case for a Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices. So if you go out to the JMIR site and just search for that, you can pull it up. I will not reveal any spoilers at the moment, but I want to talk a little bit about what the connected, the Hippocratic Oath is. So everybody's heard of the Hippocratic Oath, right? The 3,000-year-old document that doctors swear to take a symbolic oath for to protect patients and to look after their best interests. Well, increasingly, of course, medical devices are facilitating that care delivery. So as they're now the instruments, they should also be designed, built, operated, maintained with that same symbolic spirit. So we said, can we take this 3,000-year-old document and make it more modern around medical devices, connected medical devices in particular? And so working with a group of folks from across the industry, across the community, you can see some of them there along the bottom row, but I'll just read them out. So security researchers, folks from the white hat hacker community again. We worked with healthcare providers quite closely, patients quite closely. Again, so those who are patients and security researchers, device makers in the FDA quite a bit, worked with congressional staffers, talked with quite a few doctors, and worked with standards organizations to see what already existed, something we could pull through. And what we came up with was a fairly short, succinct set of statements that I think really captured the Hippocratic Oath and modernized it. And I'm not going to read that off to you. It's short, but probably too long for me to read from slides because nobody wants death by PowerPoint. But at its heart, it essentially says all systems fail. So if you believe, the engineering fundamental truth that all bridges will collapse at some point without regular maintenance, that anything can break down, then what's your ready posture towards failure? And in particular, how do you prevent harm from failure? So we looked at 5 essential capabilities or buckets of capabilities, and that is cyber safety by design. So anticipating and avoid what can come from failures. Third-party collaboration, so engaging with willing allies, such as security researchers who find and report flaws in good faith so that those can get fixed. Looking at some form of forensically sound evidence capture, so we can, when failure happens, we can learn from it. We're not left trying to guess at what might have happened or not realize that there was some kind of a security issue or reliability issue that could have caused the patient harm. To prevent cascading failures through, as we say, fail safely and fail visibly. In other words, the worst thing that can happen is for someone to rely on a device that they don't know has failed, or has failed in a way that is not simply on or off, but it's tampered with in some other way. So when failure is inevitable, make sure that fail in a way that keeps the patient safe. And that's up to the device maker to tell what's the best default posture in that case. And then for physicians to be able to know that something's wrong, so they can either rely on that or not rely on it, depending on their judgment at the time. And then to be able to kind of inoculate against future failure. So this is the idea of security updates. over time to maintain that good ready posture. You know, this guidance or this creed didn't come from whole cloth. We pulled it from existing good practices that that medical device makers have gone through. We pulled it from good practices that we've seen around the cybersecurity environment, around the cybersecurity world, and we pulled it from existing guidance from the FDA. So when you go and read the Hippocratic Oath, you'll see that when it gets into the details, a lot of the information will be fairly familiar to you. Or you might say, hey, you know, we're a medical device maker and we already do that. That's great. It's fully intended to be that way. It's to be compatible with the healthcare ethos and what's already going on in the healthcare ecosystem. So that's the general idea of the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices. Maybe now go to Suzanne or Hannes to provide some of their perspective and viewpoint on what it is. Suzanne, do you have any thoughts you want to share?
Yeah, thanks, Bo. So that's a really great overview. And one thing that strikes me that I wanted to add is very much a virtuous cycle, if you will, in that I think if we looked over the trajectory of time with regard to FDA guidances, while there are elements of the Hippocratic Oath that might have been kind of borrowed or that certainly align with the FDA guidance, I would say that we also were further informed in the development of our subsequent guidances on content from the Hippocratic Oath that clearly we agreed with and felt were really important to underscore and included them in subsequent guidances. So a very much an iterative or what I'm calling kind of a virtuous cycle, if you will. The other thing of note is, if I remember correctly, it was actually at our early 2016 public workshop, a workshop that was convened in order to enable discussion around the draft post-market guidance that we issued, that I think I Am the Cavalry actually rolled out the Hippocratic Oath initially. The timing of that is, of course, not coincidental. You know, there were things in there such as forensic evidence capture that we talked about, the importance of and our encouraging, our strongly recommending that manufacturers have coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies and processes in place and that they engage in that, our recognition prior to that of international standards as part of a formal FDA process of recognition so that we could then incorporate those and point to those within the guidance. So, you know, again, concepts, principles that that resonated with us. The framing of it, of course, resonates with me personally as a physician, and what it means to stand by principles of the Hippocratic Oath. And because we're talking about the healthcare sector, that is something that the medical device industry, as well as healthcare organizations and others, could certainly rally behind.
Hannes, any other thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, this is absolutely true. I think the most important sentence that is written in the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices, that is the punchline that you can use for every discussion with every developer out there, is that all systems fail. It's really, if you have a web application like Netflix or something, you're so big that your systems do fail and you see that. But if you create medical devices, you are more in the thousands, maybe 10,000s range of supplied devices that you have in total. It's not millions usually. So it's easier to not see those failures or to not experience those failures. So because of that, it's easy to sometimes ignore those failures because you don't expect them to happen. But when you have an attacker on there, attackers can directly trigger those failures. So the first sentence, that all systems fail and you accept this, leads automatically to more robust systems and therefore to less security vulnerabilities. So I think despite the fact that there are 5 more very important topics coming, I think the punchline that should manifestate in every single head of every single developer is that all systems fail. And what do you do against this?
Great, thanks. So that's the end of kind of our prepared remarks. I see a couple of questions already popping up. Jen, I don't know if you want me to run point on calling out the questions, or if you want to run that.
I'm happy to do it. We'll leave you to stand by and be expert, Bo. Cindy, you put the first question there into the question box. Do you want to give voice to it to the group?
Yeah, so I'm Cindy Gagan, and I'm a patient advocate and part of DiMe as well as other initiatives. If you look at the ongoing collaborations on the bottom, many of those entities are not so-called medical or healthcare regulated entities. How can we encourage a Hippocratic Oath among groups that aren't regulated, or I know this is all goodwill, but how can we incentivize cooperation or collaboration?
Yeah, really good question. One of the things that we looked at as we were going through creating this document was the fact that for it to be truly applicable across the ecosystem, we had to write it in such a way that anyone could see their own role and how they could play a part in upholding this commitment to patient care. And so we were very careful and deliberate about some of the word choices we used, some of the ways we phrased things, some of the ways we structured it, to where, hopefully just about any of these folks can look at the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical devices and see that they have a role to play. Certainly we were thinking about the people in direct line of patient care, the physicians, the patients, the device makers, the hospital administration or procurement teams, biomedical teams, for instance. But also I think it applies to other organizations as well, or other stakeholder types and roles. So if there's one specific that you've got in mind, we can maybe think about how they fit in.
So I guess I was kind of looking at it, not necessarily from a power perspective, but more of control. So, the device makers and potentially policy makers, or anybody capturing the data or having a security fail has more, they need to comply more. So like groups like patients, of whom I'm part of, or standards organizations, we can't really control any of this, right? So we could take the oath, but we really aren't protecting anything other than ourselves.
Yeah, and the way that we tried to structure this is that each of these kind of 5 bullets or 5 elements would be attestation based. So the device maker would be able to attest to what they do. So then as a doctor and as a patient, you could work together to understand in your particular situation, what are the right trade-offs for you. So in other words, the role as the patient could be asking your doctor, what do you know about the security of this? Is this device built with elements of the Hippocratic Oath for connected medical device in mind? And how do you know? If you're a physician or a doctor, you can go upstream to either directly to the device maker or to your healthcare provider and ask them that question. And to try and see that, so that, in healthcare, you have a concept of informed consent. Yep. We want the same thing for cybersecurity of devices in a way that's not going to overwhelm patients, that's going to overwhelm doctors, in a way that's written for them, not for the geeks in the back office.
Great, that's a good answer.
Well, maybe this is an opportunity for me to just also mention the peak meeting that FDA convened last month, the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee meeting, that is novel, first of all, in that it is an official advisory committee, an advisory panel that FDA has of standing members, but each panel member is a patient, him or herself, and represents a patient advocacy group too, or patient organization. And the particular topic that was the focus of September's Patient Engagement Advisory Committee meeting was on medical device cybersecurity and the importance of the patient voice, the ability to have patients' perspective in how do communications around cybersecurity of devices, particularly when vulnerabilities are identified, how is benefit risk communicated, how is the patient, him or herself, integrated and considered as really integral to those conversations. Informed consent was actually one aspect that was brought up in that public meeting. I would encourage, first of all, we have both the transcripts of that as well as a 24-hour summary of the meeting that's already posted on FDA's website. And Jen, I think if we needed to send out something afterwards as additional resources, maybe those are links that we can provide. But I would say even something else that is a little bit of a spoiler alert here, because we really heard some great recommendations coming out of the panel. That there is going to be in the next 24, 48 hours, yes, maybe even tomorrow, because it is the last day of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, a FDA voice blog that's going to be coming out that's specifically on what we learned and what are, the next steps forward with regard to the patient engagement on the medical device cybersecurity side, so that, yes, involvement of the patient as an important kind of galvanizer here with regard to cybersecurity, the transparency around vulnerabilities and an understanding of what needs to be undertaken, also given circumstances that one patient's preferences and trade-offs may be altogether very different than another one's. These are things that are really important that the FDA is thinking about. And I want to point back to the fact that it really is through the collaborative efforts with security researchers, as Bo mentioned, some of the white hat hackers as well, who are patients, who live with these devices implanted within them or connected to them, that have also helped foster these dialogues.
Thank you.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Suzanne, that's a great idea for us to include some of those additional links to the resources you mentioned, and Bo, also to the publication as well. We can certainly pop that in before we post. The next question, Susan, you mentioned in your note that you're having some difficulties with your microphone, so I'll take this one for you if this is okay. So this is a question from Susan Ramanat, who's CEO of Spiritus Partners. She asked a question for you guys about the software bill of materials, and specifically asking what FDA's position is generally, and what involvement there is with NTIA's project, which included a healthcare working group, including numerous manufacturers and leading US health systems.
Sure, I will happily take that on behalf of FDA. Yes, FDA's position is strongly aligned with the need for software transparency, a software bill of materials, and you can see that in writing in multiple places. First of all, we called that out back in 2018. April 2018, we issued a medical device safety action plan. One of the components of the safety action plan that FDA called out was medical device cybersecurity, and of the elements in there that we bulleted, one of them was a software bill of materials. We subsequently included that within a guidance update, a pre-market draft guidance update that was issued later on in October 2018, actually we went even a little bit further. We called it a cybersecurity bill of materials because we were introducing or proposing the thought of it being more than software, but hardware components as well. Based upon public comment and further discussion around that, there's a lot of recognition that the important first step, the one that is probably going to be the most critical, is getting the software bill of materials in place. And so as we look towards the revisions to that guidance and its eventual finalization, we are stating the need for manufacturers to be transparent in communicating to customers around their bill of material through an SBOM. Yes, we have been working together with NTIA. We have FDA representation directly in that effort, and we're behind the scenes part of really building that healthcare proof of concept that you have manufacturers and healthcare organizations directly engaged in. We're actually quite, proud of the fact that it was the healthcare sector that raised their hands proactively right away when NTIA introduced this as its multi-stakeholder engagement to volunteer and do such a proof of concept. And I think that points to everyone's recognition of what role an SBOM plays with respect to better preparedness and the ability to mitigate against what would be likely concerns and risks around cyber campaigns or intrusions and other types of attacks that occur on hospitals. The last thing I will add is that the FDA is in the process also of putting together, as we signaled in the Safety Action Plan, some proposed legislation in the area of medical device cybersecurity. And the SBOM is one element that would be included within that. So it would go beyond being purely a matter of choice or voluntary. Certainly we love to see manufacturers be forward-leaning and being proactive and doing this of their own accord. We also see the importance of level setting. And so for certain measures that we think are really critical in advancing cybersecurity within the healthcare public health space, SBOM is one of them that we would opt to require.
Fantastic. Thanks, Suzanne. And Susan, thanks for a great question. Michael, you popped a question into the chat. Would you like to pose that to our experts?
I did, sure. And I'll turn my video on for this. I know most of the people on the call, so I threw this out there. While there's obviously a lot of things we can talk about with the future of medical devices, healthcare delivery organizations, the life cycle on medical devices mean that they're going to be living with the insecure devices for a long time. And I wondered what everybody had to say about how those folks can best manage their environments to detect attacks, to reduce risk, et cetera, in the reality they live in now, rather than just talk about where we're going to be when we finally get all of these things fixed.
So you've asked a very big question.
Of course I did.
Absolutely.
There's probably at least a 45-minute discussion we're gonna have just on that. But I want to touch on some of the things. There's kind of a technical cybersecurity set of capabilities. Some of those deployed by probably the security team, some that can be deployed by the IT team, and then there's a non-technical or less technical approach. I'll start with the technical and go quickly so we don't lose everybody who's not a cybersecurity geek like you and me, Mike. So on the direct side, being able to instrument your healthcare or biomedical environment is always a good step, right? So there's endpoint detection mechanism, protection mechanisms, there's network detection, protection mechanisms that you can put in place on those network segments that house medical devices, medical equipment. Also, one of the scariest things these days going around hospitals is, of course, ransomware. And one of the most prominent and prevalent ways that ransomware gets around is through Active Directory. So putting something like multi-factor authentication on any Active Directory login that has high-level access to medical devices would be a really good step, or other clinical systems, because it's not just about the medical devices. It's also about the patient record system, in some case the billing system, if you want to make sure that you remain solvent, or your HR system to make sure you pay your employees so that they don't walk off the job because you can't get them paid. So those are some of the kind of technical solutions, and we can deep dive into those if other folks want to hear more. On the non-technical side, you can have just some kind of maybe a simple process for doctors, physicians. If they think something might have been tampered with, if they have a different reality than expectation when treating a patient, maybe they can flag it. And I'll give an example here. When a couple of years ago at an event called the CyberMed Summit, which our next one is coming up on November 14th and 15th in San Diego. If you like beaches and nice weather, it's a great place to be. We started doing clinical simulations where we brought doctors into an environment with a simulated patient, an actor playing a patient with a list of symptoms, and a team who all knew the conditions that were going to happen. And we did the first of these that were hacked medical device simulations. So without getting into all the details, in the debrief, what we found is that the doctors who went into those simulations, when they came out, they didn't realize that the medical device had been hacked. They knew that something was going on. They couldn't really explain it, but they didn't think about what could have been the underlying cause. They just thought medical device is not working properly and move on to the next thing. In organizations that have emergency care or other care that depends on connected medical devices, maybe a step in a checklist in treatment or in a post-mortem type action or a morbidity and mortality investigation, you can look at, was the medical device tampered with by a third party as one of the items on that checklist to evaluate. And then you can work with biomed team, you can work with third party resources, you can work with the medical device maker who can investigate that and get to it, so that, again, if something happens because of a security issue, we have the ability to learn from that for future. Mike, is that enough of an explanation? Good.
Perfect. I'd like to jump in here as well, because there's a great project led by Christopher Frenz. And Christopher Frenz has published the secure, let me not get this wrong here, secure medical device deployment standard, and it's published under the umbrella of the OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. And this is a very comprehensive list of things that an HDO can do technically to assure that medical devices, be they secure or not secure, are integrated securely into the network environment and how to handle the network. And this goes down to really from procurement issues, like what questions do you have to ask to the vendor, what do you need to do, down to installation issues, like think about configuring your firewalls correctly, your network intrusion detection systems, and so on and so forth, all the way down to post-mortem analysis and vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, and so on and so forth. This is a very great checklist that every HDO should check out when they have IT departments and medical biomed departments working together to integrate medical devices and legacy medical devices into the networks. So this is something definitely worth looking at.
Fantastic. And let's be sure to include that in our links to additional resources when we post that too. That's terrific.
Absolutely.
I have a long list of questions for you guys, but I certainly don't want to sort of take up the oxygen on this call. Anyone else with a burning question right now? Okay, so I wanted to ask about from a layperson's perspective, it's really powerful hearing sort of the words like oath and trust. And Suzanne, you spoke about sort of the virtuous cycle, and it's really exciting to see how these things are being built on. Hannes, with the example you just gave. Suzanne, you mentioned the integration into various FDA guidance, the Medical Device Safety Action Plan. One of the things I really like and enjoyed about reading the companion manuscript was the use of tangible examples, practical examples of how these things can be used and how they're powerful. Going back to this idea that it also, you know, it's all about building collective trust in these digital sort of medicine tools. How important is it, and what's the mechanism? And I apologize perhaps for my naivety around sharing examples of where there were difficulties and how they were addressed. It seems really important from a learning point of view, but is there a risk in sharing that? And are there mechanisms in sharing those sort of case examples?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's always good to share lessons learned. I think that there's been a reticence among medical device makers, among healthcare providers, among physicians to share the information because nobody wants to look bad. And people feel like if there's a cybersecurity incident, that it makes them look bad. You know, if they're the victim, there's some harm that could come to your reputation or whatever from that. I can tell you when I worked at a hospital, one of the problems that we had sharing information was we didn't know who to share it with. That was a while ago, and there are some organizations now that you can share some of this information with. First and foremost, the FDA and the medical device maker, who have gotten a lot better at taking information about potential cybersecurity issues and know what to do with them now. But also there's a number of ISACs and ISAOs, information sharing analysis centers, information sharing analysis organizations that have stood up. The National Health ISAC, for instance, and the Medical Device ISAO, which can be good points for sharing information with a broader community. Also, I think the FDA has gotten better about bringing people together and engendering trust in medical device makers to share information. So one of the world's biggest hacker conferences is called DEF CON. It happens every summer. And myself and some colleagues run the biohacking village out there. And we set it up as a safe space for everyone in the ecosystem to come together and to share information, share lessons learned. And in particular, you know, the FDA has been instrumental in showing support for the village and in kind of putting out a call for medical device makers to come and participate in that type of activity, to listen to security researchers, patients, healthcare providers, and others. And over the summer, we had about 10 medical device makers that were there and brought devices, something like 30 devices that we had, with security researchers trying to find issues. And the FDA was also there. And these device makers were confident that, you know, whatever got found, the FDA would not jump in as a regulator and start, you know, shaking their fist and doing recalls on the spot, but to work with them to address the issues at the appropriate speed with the appropriate response. So I think there's a lot of trust building that has happened, and I wonder if Suzanne or Hannes want to speak to maybe what's left to build.
Absolutely, I'll jump in here.
Yeah.
Oh,
go
Suzanne.
ahead, Hans, and then I'll go after you. No, I'll go after you.
Perfect. Well, when we first published our coordinated disclosure policy back in 2015, there was a lot of people in basically fearing that this was something that could be used against us. So I was happy that I could find allies within the company to publish this with me and just take the risk. And in the end, it turns out that the security research community is not people trying to fight against us, but trying to help. there are certainly difficulties sometimes because risk assessments from the outside might look different than risk assessments from the inside. It's not that one or the other is always right, and you have to have discussions, but it's certainly something that I learned in the past years, that the FDA, the security research community, and the manufacturers together are basically fighting for a common goal. And this is something that I have not seen in other topics. That's something I see only in cybersecurity. And I think this is what makes it so much fun to work in this sector. It's really people trying to solve problems, and we all try to solve the same problem here. And this collaboration is working really well so far.
So I'll add to that I think where the challenges lie at present, and we've recognized these, we've tried to deal with them, it just continues ongoing perseverance, is the perception of vulnerability disclosure by the public, often a result of the way it is communicated in the media. And so efforts around educating the media outlets around the fact that actually disclosure of vulnerabilities, that level of transparency is a demonstration of maturity of a sector. It's a demonstration of maturity of an organization, because if you look at the more mature sectors of industry, it is just another, best business practice that vulnerabilities are disclosed and they are appropriately dealt with, and really nobody bats an eye. But because this is something that is, first of all, tied into safety critical, the stakes are, no question about that, not just perceived, but in reality are much higher when you're talking about life and limb, and the attention that companies often get in the public space when they are champions in this area, when they are really tip of the spear as far as disclosing vulnerabilities, that attention hasn't always been positive. In fact, it's probably been more negative than positive, and FDA has really tried to amplify the importance of vulnerability disclosure and to applaud the behavior and to indicate that behavior of a company that engages in vulnerability disclosure should serve as a role model for other companies to do. So I think that, that still remains for us a challenge area. We've made some headway, but to the extent that you still have, as Bo said earlier on, quite a few manufacturers who are quite, reluctant to adopt these policies and to participate directly in vulnerability disclosures because of concern around reputational risk and how they are going to be perceived. What we're trying to do in terms of changing the narrative is actually, you'd much rather be identifying vulnerabilities up front as opposed to being in the press for incidents and exploits that have actually already occurred, where the possibility of actual patient harm is going to go up more significantly, or the possibility of disruption of clinical care and clinical operations is going to go up much more significantly. So it's really about changing a culture within a sector at large around taking on a much more proactive as opposed to reactive stance. And our position on this is one that we have also communicated broadly within the sector. I'm actually attending here right now the healthcare public health sector's bi-yearly summit, and on the cybersecurity front, having discussions with the healthcare sector's coordinating council around the importance of transparency and of information sharing and of what the incentives are for information sharing becomes really paramount.
That's fantastic. Thank you, all of you. And it's interesting to almost see sort of the dots being connected. Cindy asked her first question around, you know, what are the incentives here? And Bo sort of with Biohacking Village creating this sort of safe space for this to happen. Hannah's from the device manufacturer side, having a really positive experience with the security research community and the regulatory community. And Suzanne, you guys working so hard on the regulatory side, as you said, to try and change that narrative is exciting. I wanted, Susan, I know that you can't give voice to your question, so I'll pose your question to Suzanne as our final question for today. Susan Ramanat asked, FDA held a 2-day workshop on medical device servicing in December of last year, specifically to explore ways to improve collaboration between device manufacturers, health systems, and third-party service providers. The question is, how does that work on, and your work on cybersecurity interact with those aligned FDA efforts? Suzanne, you might be on mute.
I am, you're right. Thank you for that. I think that we're referring to the public workshop that we convened in January of 2019, and that was with the release of, that was for discussion of the earlier pre-market guidance draft update that I had mentioned, that guidance update which was released in earlier October of 2018. And again, all of our public workshops are around really trying to foster additional collaboration and dialogue across the community and really bringing all of the stakeholders to have a seat at the table. Those efforts come right out of my shop. We were the ones who did convene that workshop. It is at that workshop that the DEF CON, the We Heart Hackers Challenge was announced. From the from the podium. It was further amplified by, at the time, our commissioner, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who spoke to the importance of having that kind of unified effort in dealing with cybersecurity. And so we continue with trying to build this further. This is, as I say over and over again, whole of community. And this is what allows us to further refine our guidances and to take the comments and the feedback that we get from the entire ecosystem and further then kind of infuse our guidances with what we hear in terms of what is feasible, what's not feasible, what's a good idea, what's not a good idea. So if I understood the question correctly, it was how are we involved in that workshop? That is coming out of our shop. And so we'd be happy to engage directly with Susan or others if there are, further ideas that you might have to take this journey forward.
Fantastic. And we've had another question come in from Aluf. Aluf, would you mind posing the question to our experts? And we'll make this our last question for this lunchtime.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I was just wondering, while it's awesome to ask patients and encourage the public to try to ask these questions, and I do believe that the more people are asking these questions, the more that stakeholders will pay attention and step up. Often with medical device manufacturing, I work in medical device manufacturing, our clients are often other medical device manufacturers themselves. Their clients are often hospitals or large organizations. There's a disconnect between the patients who are often the end users of these devices and the medical device manufacturers themselves and some of the business stakeholders who are making decisions about budget. And sometimes cybersecurity kind of gets pushed off to the end or isn't a focus. How can we motivate device manufacturers, including shareholders, to make cybersecurity and safety a priority when these other factors are sort of pushing up against things? I know this is a really difficult question, but I just wanted to get your feedback, see if you had any ideas.
I'll take a quick stab, and then Suzanne probably has some thoughts. But if your clients like having devices on the market, then the FDA guidance is a good place to start. You can't get to market without going through the FDA. So being able to bring in the updated pre-market guidance, which as Suzanne mentioned was just updated about a year ago, and hopefully there'll be some final guidance sometime soon. But that can help get the attention of the board of directors, of regulatory folks, and of everybody else to say we've got to move left in the development cycle and start looking early on at how we build security in fundamentally, rather than leaving it to the end and then trying to bolt it on just before we send the package up to the FDA for approval.
And yes, and so I would add to that, aside from the work that we're doing with respect to whether, on the policy side with regard to guidance, or as I alluded to earlier, for the proposed legislation that we are working on, the legislative front, of course, is one that takes quite a bit of time. That's why guidance is so much more effective in its ability to have that flexibility and latitude to move on a continuum. But to your point around patients or end users, that is where our focus has been, and where we're going with regard to coming out of the peak meeting and other efforts that we have underway as next steps to bring the voice of the patient in more direct relationship to the manufacturer. And so we are looking forward to some additional new initiatives that we will be doing with the manufacturing community through some of our public-private partnerships that will bridge more of the dialogue that needs to take place between the end user, be it a patient or healthcare provider or healthcare delivery organization as a customer, and the manufacturer, and what FDA's expectations are with respect to, as you've said, security by design, building security in from the get-go, from the start, as well as the assurance of vigilance and continuous monitoring and maintaining cybersecurity management throughout the product's total life cycle.
Fantastic, great question, Alif. Really appreciate it, and thanks, Bo and Suzanne. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so let's wrap it up there for now. But I do encourage you. We have a We Heart Hackers channel on the DiMe Slack. Really good ongoing conversation there, and I encourage everyone to go and take a look and participate. We can certainly keep those questions coming there. First thing I'd like to do is to thank Bo and Suzanne and Hannes for joining us for a terrific discussion this lunchtime. And Bo, thank you particularly for your leadership in putting this group together. Really appreciate it. Certainly we learned a lot. Just a quick note for folks on the line, we will be posting the recording and the slides. We'll add to the slides some links to the additional resources that we mentioned during today's conversation. And just very quickly before we break, for anyone who is on the screen, we do have a few upcoming events. This coming Monday, November 4th, we have a webinar where we'll be discussing co-designing mental health apps with patient populations. That includes both the investigator for some mental health studies and also expert from the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. So really excited about that. The following week on November 12th, we have another Ask Me Anything session with some of the contributors to DiMe's recent blog post on digital medicine standards. So join us if you have time. Thank you again, everyone, for your participation today. Bo, Suzanne, and Hannes, thank you again. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.